Erik Olin Wright of the Berkeley Department of Sociology. His major works include Class Crisis in the State, Class Structure and Income Determination, and Classes, and his ongoing research concern has been with developing a general theory of class in the context of the Marxist tradition of class analysis. And we just wanted to start off asking you how you got interested in sociology in the first place.
Well, sociology seemed to me the least disciplinary of the social sciences. And I think the way to put it is that my initial interest and continuing interest was in social theory and social analysis. The question of what department to go into, what field, was strictly opportunist. It was just a question of what discipline would put the fewest constraints on me. My interest in social theory grew out of my involvement with the anti-war movement and student movement and the sort of the general radical culture of the 60s, in which I wanted to engage in understanding social change and social processes, and so the question of finding a discipline in which to do that led me into sociology. I actually had no particular stake in sociology as a field, and still don't in a certain sense.
Was this what might have drawn you to Marxism as an orientation theoretically?
Well, the Marxist commitments within social science for people in general, certainly the case for me, I think, come directly out of political involvements, political and moral involvements, and not out of any sort of inner logic of social theory itself, which drives you to realize the great truths of the Marxist tradition. But I think you're right that the reason why I ended up being a Marxist and I ended up being a sociologist both came from engagements with problems of understanding social change in contemporary conditions.
And Marxism was able to speak to some of those problems and adequately conceptualize them?
Well, I think the way I would put it is that at the time I was becoming politically radicalized, really the only game in town was Marxism. There just weren't other theoretical options. So if you were a radical in the 60s and an intellectual and cared about understanding the problems you were struggling over and wanted to go beyond simple radical critique, but towards framing alternatives and understanding the processes involved, really in the middle to late 60s, the only theoretical tradition that had any force to it was Marxist. And I think that's what drew me towards Marxism as such. It was in a sense a fairly intellectual choice. I was not involved in any Marxist political movements. I didn't belong to any of the pre-party formations or whatever that were proliferating in the late 60s and early 70s. It was much more in the context of being politically radical and then seeking coherent theoretical approaches that led me towards a Marxist perspective.
But Marxism isn't really the only game in town anymore, or maybe you would say it still is, but it seems like there are more games in town now. What kind of holds you to a Marxist perspective?
Well, I think it's the best game in town, even if it's not the only game in town. I don't see rival radical theories as offering more powerful and more coherent frameworks for either asking questions or generating answers to pressing theoretical problems. Herb Gintis, 8 or 10 years ago, used a metaphor which I still like, even though I think he would abandon it at this point. And he once said that Marxism was the ship that was carrying us from the shore of capitalism to the land of socialism. We were in the middle of the ocean. The ship was very leaky, but there weren't any other ships in sight. And our choice was to abandon ship and never reach our destination, or to frantically try to repair it en route. One does see nowadays other ships on the horizon, but they seem leakier, and some of them are going in a perpendicular direction to the destination, or not moving at all. And at least for the moment, it seems to me this still does offer the most constructive general theoretical framework within which to approach these kinds of issues.
Okay, Professor Wright, would you please highlight on the professional and personal reference groups which have influenced your theoretical work?
Well, that's changed over time. As a student here in the early 70s, my major reference group was a circle of graduate students with a few bedraggled faculty members, none of whom were in this department, and most of whom were not in this university. It was a Bay Area circle of people that formed themselves into a work collective around the journal Capitalist State. That journal really was, I think, my primary intellectual reference group in the early 70s. It was sort of steadfastly and stubbornly Marxist, although not terribly orthodox in its orientation, placing the problem of the state at the center of its analysis. It worked, though, very clearly within orthodox categories, even if its positions on all questions was not particularly orthodox. Jim O'Connor was I suppose, the leading professional figure in that group, but there was a range of students and hangers-on who were associated with it. In the last 8 or 9 years, I think that my primary reference group has shifted to a group of Marxist theorists who describe themselves as analytical Marxists. It contains people who are trained in analytical philosophy, economics, and a couple of sociologists and historians. This group is less Marxist than my formative reference group. In fact, some of the members of the group at this point probably don't even use the label anymore. And its defining characteristic is less agreement on a set of substantive claims about the world and more an agreement on a particular style of debate and thinking, very much in the tradition of analytical philosophy, arguing over clarity of definitions, the necessity for very precise logical steps between points in an argument, and so on. That's really become my major reference group, in the sense of the people about whom I worry when I'm writing, because I know they won't let me get away with anything.
So you mean professional reference groups are more powerful than the personal reference groups?
Well, with respect to my intellectual work, the distinction isn't all that clear. I mean, these people are also personal associates and friends and colleagues. They're people who I fight with and argue with. In terms of personal reference groups outside of my work, I don't think they impinge terribly deeply on my academic preoccupations and the like. I am not engaged in what could be called a political reference group in any direct way, which would be another way in which a person's work is disciplined and held accountable to some authority other than themselves. The sense in which my work maintains at least a thread of connection to more directly political involvement, I think centers on choices that I make about where to publish, and therefore whom I have to satisfy in writing and arguing. I continue to try to publish my most important theoretical statements in journals like New Left Review, and I consider that as a way of defining my general audience in a political way rather than a purely academic way.
This kind of leads into our next question. You talked about Marxism being like a ship that's kind of in the ocean on the way to socialism, or the land of socialism. in working within the Marxist tradition, you're clearly, I mean, at least hopefully, helping to patch the leaks in the ship, but the ship could still just be sitting in water.
Right.
I mean, how have you adjusted to the kind of inherent tension between being an academic and being a Marxist?
Yes, I'm definitely patching the holes rather than fixing the propeller, as it were, and or repairing the sails. Well, to be completely honest about that issue, it has not been a source of deep existential angst for me. I'm real happy as an intellectual. I have to force myself to feel miserable about not being more politically active. That doesn't mean that I don't feel the tension around fears that my work could be utterly pointless and that it could have no political relevance. But in terms of my own engagement with political movements, being on the barricades, as it were, in the thick of things, that is not actually a deep source of frustration on my part, as it would be for many people who would share the same political and moral commitments that I do. Now, I suppose the reasons for that come from my biography and socialization. I grew up in an exceptionally academic family. Both of my parents were academics. Both of my siblings have become academics. I knew I wanted to be a professor from about age 10, and the only issue from that point on was what field I would be in. So I just always had this way of living as something I enjoyed and felt comfortable with, and therefore the issue of being sheltered from politics in the ivory tower I don't feel as an emotional stress. Now, from an intellectual point of view, I see it as a problem. I don't mean to dismiss this as an issue, but it doesn't resonate with my own personality, if you will, as an issue. As an intellectual issue, I think it is important, but it's a problem that it's very difficult to do much about in a period of history in which there are not mobilized, effective political movements which, as an intellectual, I could link up with. For me to be part of a socialist movement in the United States in an activist sense now would completely preempt my ability to be effective as a teacher and academic. If you have ongoing socialist movements and political movements of various sorts, then it's possible to be affiliated and participant as an intellectual without it preempting all other possible activities. So at this point in history, it's a difficult problem to resolve at the individual level.
How do you feel about the fact that most of your work is read by an academic audience?
Well, first of all, that's not entirely true, because I do publish things in more politically oriented journals, such as New Left Review. And my guess is that while there are certainly intellectuals who read New Left Review, I would be surprised if the majority of readers of New Left Review are actually in the professoriate, literally academics. But basically, you're right. Most of my stuff, certainly in English, is read by academics. I guess that's the other point to make initially. A lot of my work has been translated. I know that, for example, there's a South Korean translation of Class Crisis in the State. I doubt very much if it's mainly academics who are reading that. From what I've been told, the pirate Korean edition, because it was published, which is fine with me, it was published not with any royalty arrangement with the English publisher. That edition is read, I suspect, primarily by politically involved young intellectuals in the Korean students' movement, perhaps even beyond that. So that's one thing. But I think it's still true that my writing is primarily directed towards academically trained people. And the question is then whether that's a problem or a limitation. it's what I do well, I think. I haven't written very much of a more popular nature, and I think my strengths are in working on conceptual and analytical issues that are typically confused or muddled in theoretical discourses, rather than in popularizing those issues for broader constituencies. And because it's what I do well, in a sense, I've specialized in that. I don't know if that's an adequate defense of it. I do feel that as a teacher in relatively elite institutions like Wisconsin or Berkeley, much of what I do is teach future teachers, many of whom will be engaged in teaching outside of such institutions, and that the impact of one's ideas and one's professional work therefore can extend beyond the more rarefied circles through that role as well.
So it's like broadcasting.
Yeah, it's kind of like broadcasting.
But in the preface of the book, you have mentioned that your work is primarily directed towards the Marxist as well as non-Marxist audience. So it's a discourse, but that's not true, it seems. What you said.
That it's primarily directed at a Marxist
as well as non-Marxist scholars.
Well, I think my work is primarily directed towards radicals, not the mainstream. Occasionally, in very specific pieces, I've addressed the mainstream in in somewhat grandiose attempts at perhaps, on the one hand, legitimating Marxist theory in the broader community of scholars, and with some illusions that I might even convince somebody. But by and large, I see what I'm doing as solving problems and clarifying issues that are internal to radical theory. It is also internal to Marxist theory, but I don't think the relevance of what I do is restricted simply to people who, in a narrower sense, restrict their work to a Marxist perspective.
When you were solving some of these problems within the Marxist framework of class analysis, to use your metaphor, patching up some of the holes, what kind of problems were there that needed to be addressed by using the technique of survey research when you started out?
Well, I don't consider the survey research I've done as part of the hole patching operation, if you will. The hole patching operation, that metaphor, it's a little hokey, I suppose, but that metaphor is mainly directed towards the theoretical and conceptual work that I've been preoccupied with, primarily around the problem of class structure and, in particular, in class analysis in general. In that terrain of concepts, I have been especially concerned with trying to theorize or conceptualize the problem of the middle class and how that can be incorporated within a Marxist framework. There is, as I've sometimes said, a certain embarrassment to Marxists of the existence of the middle class. It's been a persistent problem to adequately theorize a non-polarized class position within a class theory that's inherently polarized, built around polarities. That's been the core conceptual problem that I've been perhaps obsessed with over the past 10 years or so, and in which I've made a variety of attempts at solution. The survey research which I've done, using those concepts, so far I think has only borne relatively meager fruits. I don't think that I have produced any sort of great new discoveries from the survey research that could be counted as breakthroughs or fundamental new understandings of the character of the empirical structure of class relations. There are a range of interesting results from different specific studies and certain fairly provocative findings and sometimes anomalies, but their main impact comes through the way that these empirical investigations provoke new conceptual and theoretical thinking. rather than in the power of the results as such. I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but
Would you please, Professor Wright, would you please elaborate on what sorts of problems do such concepts as class consciousness, ideology, or even class itself pose for survey research? Could you please elaborate?
well, some of the problems they pose for survey research are the same as the problems that any concept poses for survey research. That's what I would consider the most fundamental issue. There are then certain specific problems posed by different ones of the concepts you listed. Let me first make some general comments about the difficulty of translating any concept into survey research, and then I can make a specific comment on class structure and class consciousness. I mean, the general problem is that to go from the abstractions of these concepts to a table on a page in an article you're writing, you have to go through what could be called a series of translations. You have to go from the abstract concept to what could be called an operational concept, from the operational concept to a set of observations, and from the observations to a set of variables. And in each of those translations, you have to make a whole range of decisions, many of which are arbitrary, theoretically unmotivated. In my own work, I felt that the most precarious step in that sequence of operations is actually the final one, going from the observations that you make in a survey to the variables you use in a piece of data analysis. And it is frequently the case that the way you aggregate your data into general descriptive categories to be used in a regression equation or a crosstab or whatever, the way you aggregate those observations is much more important for the final picture you get than the conceptual starting point. You could start with my framework or a Weberian framework or a Goldthorpe framework or whatever, and end up with radically different, with any of those, with radically different descriptive pictures on the page in a table, depending upon these relatively innocent-looking, theoretically undermotivated, if not unmotivated, decision rules about how to deal with missing data, how to deal with contradictory multiple indicators, and so on. Now, in the case of class consciousness in particular, there is an added problem for survey research beyond the general problems of concept and measure and operationalization and aggregation. And that is that the concept of class consciousness refers to a mechanism that exists, I would argue, in the world, but whose effects are contingent upon a collective context of struggle. So that to measure class consciousness by asking isolated individuals a set of attitude questions is problematic, beyond what is always problematic about asking people questions about anything. It's problematic because the theory of class consciousness argues that it has its consequences not atomistically through isolated individuals, but it has its consequences through the way it intersects collective processes of struggle, class formation, collective action, and so on. So to a certain extent, I think, there's a logical incompatibility between the concept of class consciousness, understood in that way, and the observations you make through a survey. What I attempt to do, or to argue in my analysis, is, in effect, that what I'm really measuring are class attitudes. And at most, I believe that there is a non-random relation between class attitudes and class consciousness. That if you hold a pro-working class attitude, that is, as an atomistic response to a survey question, that implies a greater likelihood that you have a disposition towards working class consciousness if the proper organizational and historical conditions for that consciousness to be present existed. But strictly speaking, my research is not about class structure and class consciousness. It's about class structure and class attitudes. And I kind of glorify it by calling it class structure and class consciousness.
This is kind of moving on to a little bit different topic. We're kind of interested in your view on contemporary social movements. The civil rights movement, peace movement, anti-nuclear movement, feminist movements. Do you think that they're primarily class-based social movements?
Well, partially that depends upon what the expression class-based means, what the word based means. I certainly do not think that it is necessarily the case that these movements are simply disguised class movements, that these are really class struggles that simply have taken a rhetorical form of feminist struggles. Now that, or whatever. Now that could be the case. There are certainly historical instances where the rhetoric of a conflict could be religious, but the combatants in the struggle were clearly class-based combatants, and the interests at stake in the conflict were class interests. Arguably, and people have argued that that was the case, for example, in the Puritan Revolution in England in the 17th century. I don't think, in fact, that's the case in contemporary social movements that you described, and I'm not convinced it was the case in the 17th century English Revolution either. But in any case, if class-based means that the motivations and interests of the actors in feminist movements or anti-nuclear movements should be primarily understood as class motivations and interests, no, they're not class-based. If, however, by one is...
So you don't believe in the idea of kind of false consciousness, necessarily? Or you
Well,
think
that's a separate issue. That is, it could be whether or not a person who is pursuing an ecological objective because they care about the environment in its own right could be adequately described as having false consciousness would depend upon what else they believe. If they believe that we don't have to threaten capitalist property relations in order to solve ecological problems, if they believe that ecological problems can be solved within a capitalist context in which the property rights of capitalists remain unthreatened in any way, that ecology is compatible with the reproduction of capitalist power, then I think they have a false understanding of the nature of capitalism.
What do you mean by unthreatened? I mean...
I think that in order to solve ecological problems, at a minimum, capitalist property rights have to be compromised. Capitalist power has to be reduced. The autonomy of capitalists to allocate resources and to accumulate capital according to the logic of the market has to be curtailed. Now, whether or not it has to be broken is whether or not air pollution requires socialism is another question. I don't think a priori any particular problem, any particular negative externality of capitalism requires the destruction of capitalism. I do believe that collectively they do. That is, I think it may be possible to solve air pollution within the constraints of capitalism by suitably curtailing capitalist property rights. I very much doubt whether it's possible to solve all environmental degradation without so curtailing capitalist property rights that that the efficiency of capitalist production would deteriorate to the point that socialism would be clearly a preferable alternative. So I would describe an environmentalist who was also pro-capitalist, I would argue, either is not really an environmentalist, that is, that's just a smokescreen for something else, or they don't understand the way the world works. They've got...
Well, see, then you come into the problem of what pro-capitalist means. I mean, if you could have an environmentalist, from what you're saying, who doesn't particularly believe in socialism as the system that we should have, but is oriented toward ecological goals. I mean, those aren't incompatible from what you said. It's just that a general consciousness.
Yes, I meant the pro-capitalist in the sense of believed in the virtues of unfettered capitalist property rights, and that the market and capitalism should be left free, and who believed therefore that ecological problems were primarily a question of attitudes and culture. You know, that it's because we don't take care of the environment enough. Now, somebody who had that view, I would say, has, quote, false consciousness, in the sense that they have an incorrect understanding of the mechanisms that are producing the problems which they find abhorrent.
How would you address, like, the feminist movement from a Marxist perspective? I mean, I think a lot of people kind of see that maybe feminism and Marxism, although they may overlap, they kind of approach things, at least the variables that they see as having causal primacy are different. How do you approach the feminist movement from a Marxist perspective or through Marxist analysis?
Well, the first point is that I don't believe it is necessarily the case that Marxist theory, as Marxist theory, can adequately understand gender. But that's not necessarily an indictment of Marxist theory. I think that Marxist theory would have things to say to gender analysis, but I don't think it follows that for Marxist theory to be a coherent theory, it has to be able to explain everything about gender. The way I would then pose the question would be that for a Marxist to study gender would be to analyze the ways in which the existing structure of class relations and class power, the basic ways in which social resources are monopolized and exploitation is reproduced, the way those structures constrain the possibilities of transformation of gender relations. Now, I would pose it that way. What I would want to answer is, to what extent and in what ways does the existing structure of property relations and class relations constrain the possibilities of transformation of gender relations? That leaves open the question, or the answer, that in this particular epoch it doesn't constrain it very much. It may be that gender relations are radically transformable within the existing property relations. Mm-hmm. But the Marxist question would be to assess the ways in which class constrains or facilitates transformations of gender. One of the ways that constraining process could occur is that certain aspects of gender relations have become functionally necessary for capitalism. That's one possible answer. Mm-hmm. That then implies there's a very powerful constraint, because if they're functionally necessary for capitalism, and if capitalists are powerful, then it may be the only way to transform those gender relations is to break the institutional structure which requires them. I don't happen to think, I'm not at all convinced by Marxist feminist arguments that take the form of arguing that patriarchy is functionally required by capitalism. I, in fact, think that if it would be possible to snap your fingers and get rid of patriarchy, that is, if we could have a costless transition, the actual elimination of gender inequality would not be incompatible with capitalism. Mm-hmm. Indeed, capitalism, in fact, might function more efficiently as a system of exploitation and commodity relations in the absence of patriarchy than in the presence of patriarchy.
Or you could say the opposite, too, couldn't you? I mean, you could say that if capitalism were abolished, that wouldn't necessarily mean that there would be gender equality either. I mean...
Right, no, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
the way I think that if capitalism were abolished, it would make the struggle for gender equality enormously easier, but it wouldn't in and of itself eliminate gender equality.
Well, don't you think then, I mean, we're kind of in this class trying to deal with the issue of problem-oriented sociology versus puzzle-solving oriented sociology, and kind of the idea of working within a theoretical framework, and then having your questions kind of posed within the context of that framework versus working outside of a particular framework and like finding a problem and then trying to solve it. I mean, wouldn't a Marxist framework be limiting in terms of studying a lot of gender issues because it only approaches the questions in a certain way, and that there might be a lot of questions related to gender that would lie that you wouldn't even see necessarily looking through that framework?
Absolutely. I think that's true. I think there are certain questions that if you care about, you'd be ill-advised to adopt a Marxist framework as the sole basis for understanding that issue. That, however, doesn't imply that the kinds of mechanisms and processes specified in Marxist theory aren't relevant to gender analysis, but there would be all sorts of problems internal to gender theory which the categories available in Marxist theory have absolutely nothing to say. They're completely silent on. And Marxists who attempt to treat Marxist theory as a general social science in the sense that a comprehensive theory of everything, I think are living in fantasy land. You know, it's just now whether or not a general theory of society is possible, but is whether within a coherent and integrated framework, all social variations and mechanisms could be subsumed in an integrated way. I don't know. None of the attempts at producing that degree of totalization of the theoretical frameworks I've found successful. They either end up being completely vacuous, you know, going into just levels of meta-theoretical conceptual abstractions where there's no mechanisms, or they're reductionist in ways that are utterly, totally implausible. So the way I prefer to think of it is that what Marxist theory has done is staked out a set of powerful mechanisms that shape the possibilities of human action and shape it in ways that impinges on everything, but which does not solve all problems. Now, I do think that it's the case that the mechanisms that Marxist theory is preoccupied with, class, exploitation, and the institutional structures built up around class and exploitation, powerfully do constrain the possibilities of transformation of gender relations. And that the reason for that constraint is not the functional one that has sometimes been argued. That is, it's not that capitalism requires male domination, but it's rather that the social processes needed to transform gender relations require a degree of mobilization, of struggle, and of reorientation of resources in order to make the transformation itself. That is what is incompatible with capitalism. It's not so much that the end state, that's why I said if you could snap your fingers and just get rid of gender inequality so that there was literally a gender-blind androgynous society, you know, where men are as likely to stay home with children as women are, everything would be completely gender-blind. Capitalism might, in fact, thrive under those conditions. But to get from here to there, given the way in which gender inequality is entrenched in institutions and in material relations and in the social organization of resources, to get to that point would require massive mobilizations and transformations and struggles, and that's what would be incompatible with capitalism.
So it sounds like Marxism and feminism would have a lot of interplay. That in a sense, feminism would pose certain questions that Marxism might take and might take as sort of motivation or inspiration, and then some of the Marxist concepts of class and exploitation have bearing on the further explanation of these questions. Then, so would you say that you wouldn't really want to dwell, to use this certain phrase you've been using in methods class, you wouldn't really want to dwell too deeply within a paradigm, so that you wouldn't even be able to see questions that arise sort of external to it?
Well, I do dwell pretty deeply within a paradigm. I'm not sure. I mean, my position on this may be not quite the same issue that you're raising. I believe that it's necessary to be a kind of to be sort of skeptically dogmatic about one's framework, to stick to it, but not too stubbornly. You know, to adopt a framework because it provides coherence, but to be fuzzy around the edges of it. You know, to allow influences from other perspectives. And that the central guiding thread which keeps the integrity of the enterprise are the questions which you're asking, more than it is the answers which you're producing. Now, the question then is, first of all, there isn't such a thing as feminist theory. There's such different feminisms. You know, that the difference between radical feminism and socialist feminism and Marxist feminism and sort of liberal feminism as theoretical, political packages is quite striking, and the only thing they have in common is seeing that gender is important. But that's kind of like saying, you know, radical theorists in general see domination as important or something. I mean, it doesn't give it much theoretical specificity. If gender analysis is asking questions which bear on the questions that are of central concern to Marxists, questions about class formation and transformation of the state and the possibilities of social change. That is, if theses and mechanisms being postulated within gender-based feminist analysis bear on those kinds of questions, then I think Marxists have to pay attention to it, and it's at their peril that they don't. Now, to some extent, that's because I believe that there are real mechanisms in the world independent of our theories, and that paradigms are ways of making coherent our perceptions of those mechanisms. And therefore, I'm perfectly prepared to be convinced that there are mechanisms outside of Marxist theory that are more important for the questions I'm asking than the mechanisms postulated inside of Marxist theory. That may be a sort of mushing the distinction between problem-centered and puzzle-solving approaches. Or perhaps one oscillates back and forth between them.
Maybe there isn't such a distinction, necessarily. Anybody else have any questions they want to ask?
Let me ask one more question. Let me get into the self-criticism. How might you criticize your perspective, your own perspective from a non-Marxian point of view? Okay, Professor Wright.
Check it there just to be sure it's going both places. Okay.
Okay, Professor Wright, let me go into the part of self-criticism. How might you criticize your perspective from a non-Marxian point of view?
From a non-Marxist.
Non-Marxian point of view.
I suppose the simplest non-Marxist criticism of what I do is that it's all bullshit. that I'm postulating a set of mechanisms that are entirely constructed internal to the discourse, and that they don't have any ontological status outside of Marxist theory. So, for example, just to illustrate that, at the heart of my reconceptualization of class structure following the work of John Romer, I argue that skills can be a basis for exploitation. The basis of that argument is that there is a monopoly rent in the wages that skilled wage earners particularly professional wage earners, earn.
Mhm.
Now, a neoclassical economist could come back and say that's nonsense, that what I'm calling a monopoly rent is simply the return to the higher productivity of the skill possessor, that these wages reflect the demand for productive skills, and that the fact that these wages are above the cost of producing the skill is irrelevant. What matters is that the contribution to production of skilled workers is remunerated proportionate to its contribution, and therefore it can't be exploitative. Well, that would imply, that way of reasoning would imply that my argument is based on a linguistic trick by playing games with the notion of exploitation and labor and so on. The basic way in which my work has been criticized by mainstream sociologists has been by silence. I mean, there's very little debate and discussion in the mainstream, in the journals, critical discussion about the substance of the arguments that I make, or that Michael Buravoy makes, or that others make. And that's in a way the main way in which it's contended with, rather than by engagement with its claims about the way the world works itself. I suppose that the major objection to my general approach that would be made by someone who wanted to engage the substance of the argument and not just, make pot shots at it in the way I just described, would be to dispute the argument that class and class structure has any privileged explanatory role in understanding the constraints and possibilities on social change. They would look for the central mechanisms that propel or obstruct change as lying in other spheres of social life. So it would not necessarily be a rejection of my characterization of class as such, but my and Marx's general claim that this has any special importance for anything else. So the kind of explanatory ambitions of the class theory would be rejected. Then there are lots of specific criticisms that have been raised about my particular conceptualization of class as well. John Goldthorpe has a different approach, and he argues that the concept of the service class is a more coherent one than the concept of contradictory class locations and so on. There'd be a whole range of specific details of that sort that one could mention.
Is there anything more you'd like to add in closing? Anything we haven't covered of that nature?
Well, this is quite a comprehensive list. The one thing that you mentioned in our discussions prior to this august event was, what I thought methodologically was the most pressing issue that the next generation of sociologists ought to be concerned with, which took me aback because I thought of myself as the next generation, so to speak. But, and that's a related point to what I've been saying, that I think the most pervasive methodological problem, methodological in the sense of meta-theoretical, is trying to really understand what it means to talk about causal asymmetries, what it means for Marxists to claim that class has a certain explanatory primacy. What does primacy mean? Claims about the relative importance of different causes, of different mechanisms, come up time and time again in all sorts of debates, debates between paradigms, debates within paradigms. It's often, in fact, the major issue, at least on the surface, at stake in contending paradigms. Between Marxism and feminism, it's certainly the case that the battleground of those debates is often waged on the question of, is class more important than gender for explaining X, Y, or Z? But the meaning of the expression more important than is very under-theorized, unspecified, ill-defined. It's just not clear what more important means. And I think that that's a methodological issue that really needs to get resolved in order to get beyond the kind of rhetorical postures of the debates around those issues that exist at the moment. So that's a closing pot shot of my own.
We'll work on it.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much.